I want to talk about my favorite shock for the SCX24, and it is not something you buy, it's something you make. It is a hybrid shock. It's a cross between the Hobby Plus CR24/CR18 alloy shock and the stock SCX24 shock. The reason that I go through the effort of doing this is because you can get kind of the best of both shocks, and it's something that isn't really offered anywhere else. So in the hybrid shock, you take the spring from the stock shock and reuse it, so you get a soft spring, and you retain the adjustable preload from the SCX20 or the CR24 shock, and you also get the additional travel of the CR24 shock as well. Something else is it has a lot of travel for the size of shock that it is, and what I mean by that is the stock shock is 31.5 millimeters from eye to eye uncompressed. Compressed, it's 22.5, so that's shock travel of 9 millimeters. And that 9 millimeters is 28.6% of its uncompressed length. So remember, 28.6%. The HR shock that has been around forever, I think it was the first aftermarket shock, it's been copied a million times, has the same uncompressed length of 31.5. Its compressed length is 23.5, so it is actually a millimeter less of suspension or shock travel. So that 8 millimeters is 25.4% of the uncompressed length. So over 3% less travel for the size shock it is, basically. The hybrid shock is quite a bit longer. So it's 39 millimeters uncompressed. So it's not quite as long as a double barrel. A double barrel is 43 millimeters. And compressed, it's 26. That is shock travel of 13 millimeters. So it gets you an additional 4 millimeters of travel over stock. And that's 33.3% of the uncompressed length. So that's the reason I really like it, is because it's kind of like a double barrel shock in that it compresses down pretty small for the amount of travel that you get out of it. But unlike a double barrel, not only is it not quite so long, but you also don't have to worry about it binding, all the different pieces binding, and you can run grease in them because not as much of the shock is exposed, because the double barrels, basically all of the shock is exposed at some point through the travel of the shock. So if you coat it in grease, it's just the whole thing's just be covered in dirt when you run it. This one you can put some grease in it, and I usually do. It doesn't last forever like any of the unsealed shocks. You have to reload it periodically, but once they wear in, and they do require a little bit of wear in time, just due to the machining and stuff not being perfect, but once they wear in, they're actually a pretty smooth shock. So if this doesn't interest you, I guess you're not watching anymore, but if you're intrigued, I will show you the process of how this works. A few tools are needed. You may be able to do this with fewer tools, just depending on how you want to do it. The only thing that you really need is a pin vise, which is just this handle for a drill bit, and you need this drill bit, which is a 1.5 millimeter drill bit, and you just throw it in the chuck, and it allows you to drill out the pedestal of the shock. So you absolutely have to have this if you want to do the conversion. I wouldn't recommend doing it without this drill bit, because you could crack the plastic whenever you try to thread the larger shaft from the CR24 shock into the smaller hole in the pedestal on the stock 24 SCX24 shock. So to begin, also of course, your hex wrench 1.27 / 0.050 hex wrench, and this just makes things, it can make things easier. It's just your standard 4mm nut driver. So you get started, you have to take apart both of the shocks. The SCX24 shock comes apart pretty easily. You just unscrew the top cap of it, and then you have to take your hex wrench or hex driver, put it in the inside, and unscrew the shaft from the bottom, and it just comes apart. Very easy. So you can set those parts aside. This part will not be used at all, so it can be put aside. These parts will be reused: the spring and the pedestal, the bottom part of the shock. So don't lose those. Of course, the next thing is to take apart the CR24 shock. Just take the top cap off of that, which will not be reused. You can take off that preload collar. It will be reused, so keep up with that. The spring, which is just too stiff. You could run it, I guess, if you had a heavy truck, but I've never done that. So that's, in my opinion, it's just too stiff, so we'll toss that. And then you have to remove the shock shaft from the bottom part, the bottom, I'll call it a pedestal. You might be able to do this with your hands, but probably not. So you'll need a screwdriver, which I did not mention. Sorry about that. It's just a regular Phillips screwdriver. This is a 00 size Phillips screwdriver, but it doesn't have to be quite this small. But the 00 does tend to work pretty well. Just take that off. Like I said, you can put that aside, won't be using that. So now we have our pieces. We have the shock body, the shaft, the spring, preload collar, and the bottom and the top. So there are a couple of different ways you can do this. I'm going to go ahead and drill out the bottom, because you have to do that on either method. Make sure you are drilling in as straight as you can, of course, because if you aren't straight, then you can actually kind of ruin the shock. So what I do is I just periodically just turn the entire thing as I'm drilling in, just to make sure that I'm not off. But once you get started, it gets easier. Kind of guides itself in. And that's it. Be some plastic that comes out, not a lot. And then you just take the CR24 shaft and just kind of set it on the edge there. Grab your Phillips screwdriver and thread it in. And this can take a little bit of doing. I don't know if you can see this. You're trying to get it straight. So just keep working that in, and you don't want to go too far. It is possible to thread this in too far, and it can actually send the shaft into this pivot ball and bind it up. So if that does happen to you, just back it off and leave it there. Definitely don't go too far. So the way that I normally judge it is if you see the bottom here, there's like a little bit of a lip there on the shaft that is exposed, and that's usually how I know I've gone the right distances. You can just see that. Maybe it shows up in video. You can just see just a little bit, and that's what you want. Okay, so now all you really need to do is put the spring back on, put the preload collar on like this, and then put the top part on. Now the threads on this shock body do not match the threads on the stock SCX24 cap. And what that means is you're going to be cross-threading. It's going to feel wrong, but that's what you got to do. And once you get it cross-threaded on there, it basically creates new threads in the plastic. And it's not a big deal. Like if you want to take it apart to reload the grease in the shock, it comes apart pretty easy and goes back together pretty easy. But the first time you do it, yeah, it's going to feel very wrong. Usually I have to back this preload collar down so I can grab more of the shock body and then just get it on there. And this does require some force, but you can tell when it stops being just difficult and starts being impossible, and that's how you know you have it all the way on there. Let's see here. I think, nope, it's still going. Okay, it is no longer moving, so now I know I have it all the way, and I can put the shock collar back up there. If you want to use the stock pivot balls, like if you have a pretty stock mounting situation, and you can just leave it here and you're done. That's kind of the nice thing about this is you can mount it just like a stock shock because the top and bottom are stock. It works just like a stock shock. It's just longer. And you've got adjustable preload, so that's cool. However, there is something that I've kind of figured out how to do just today, actually, because I have a truck that I'm building that has different mounting points, and they're wider. And basically, what was happening is this pivot ball is not long enough, right? Like the mount was, I guess, a little bit too far out, and the shock body was hitting the frame rail, and it was just causing binding in the shock. And I mean, you can technically just back off this screw, back off the threads in this pivot ball, and give yourself some clearance, but I don't really want to do that. I want something that's a little more secure. So what I've done is I've taken pivot balls, like the stock plastic pivot balls that come with the suspension links for the SCX24, and I've put them in the end here. You can see on this shock, it's kind of like a cooking show. This is already done. Let's see if it focus. It's not going to focus. But maybe you can see I have this pivot balls in here, and let me grab a screw. Okay, so it's a perfect size for a screw, of course, because this is the way it's set up for the suspension links. And the top one just snaps right in, no problem. The bottom one is a little more difficult, and I'll show you that. So we can remove these pivot balls. They just snap out pretty easy. The top one is usually easier than the bottom one for whatever reason. So now these are empty. And like I said, the top one just snaps in. It's easy. And what I do is I take a screw and I put it through the pivot ball like this. And then I put that on top of my driver. And I just push the entire thing through the top of the shock. And I go from the inside out. And you'll hear it snap. So this one's done. Easy. Right? It's moving around, has plenty of range of motion here, so it's not going to bind up whenever the suspension moves. But you can run a screw through it. So this can be out from the chassis rail as far as you want it. You might have to use a spacer depending on what your setup is, but you're no longer limited by the short threads, relatively short threads on this pivot ball. The bottom part, you can see maybe this side is more closed than this side. This side's bigger because what it's designed for on the stock pivot ball is it snaps in from the more open side, and the closed off side is just big enough for you to get your driver in so you can tighten it up. When you're using these pivot balls, you need this. You need to open up this more closed off side, or the pivot ball will bind on it. It doesn't move around enough, and that's where this other drill bit comes in. So this is a 3.2 millimeter drill bit. Maybe you could do this with a standard like Imperial drill bit. I don't know. I do know that the 3.2 millimeter that I have works really well, so that's what I use. So I basically just load this into the pin vise, and from the closed off side, just get that started. And be careful when you're doing this, because it will want to bite and just send it all the way through the hole, but you're not really trying to do that. You're really just trying to open up that one side. So that's what I just did. And it might take a couple of tries to get it all cleaned out. But now that side is opened up more and allows space for the pivot ball to actually work. It looks like I still need to clean this out just a little bit. Yeah, that's fine. So again, the same sort of technique, loading the pivot ball on a screw, putting that screw on the hex driver, and finding that more open side, loading it on there, and let's see if I can do this. It just snaps on. It does require a fair amount of force. If it feels like you're breaking it, well, you might be breaking it, but also you might just be on the edge of what you need to do, so don't be afraid to give her. So you can see now what I was talking about with that closed side. If you can imagine that being more closed off and basically limiting the range of motion on that pivot ball, but since it's more opened up, this is enough. It's not as much as the top, but it really doesn't need to be as much as the top. This is almost like too much. But it's going to move as much as it needs to move. So there we go. This thing is ready to mount just like the HR shocks, right? With screws, just any length screw you want. I think this is a good option, at least for me. It may be a good option for other people, and that's why I made the video. I think I've showed all the steps. If you have any questions, let me know, and I'll do my best to answer them. Thanks.